Good morning from Chicago. We are excited to begin our two-day symposium commemorating the 50th anniversary of the publication of George Stigler's seminal article, The Theory of Economic Regulation.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capital Isn't, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
Have you ever heard the term regulatory capture? If you did and did not know where it comes from, you certainly want to listen to this episode where we are going to provide you the excerpts of a very interesting conference that was organized recently by the Stigler Center to celebrate the namesake of the center, George Stigler, and the publication 50 years ago of a piece called A Theory of Economic Regulation that really generated the idea behind the concept of regulatory capture.
So, Luigi, this spring marks the 50th anniversary of the publication of George Stigler's seminal article, The Theory of Economic Regulation. A central thesis of this paper is that, as a rule, regulation is acquired by the industry and is designed and operated primarily for its benefit. How would you summarize what his article said?
So Stigler tries to bring regulation inside the economic discussion. So regulation was seen as a way to fix problems created by markets, but was not discussed as the product of a political process driven by politicians who have their own self-interest. And so he, in the paper, goes a bit extreme by saying that all regulation is simply acquired by the industry and designed with the interests of the industry in mind. So the regulation, instead of helping consumers, help the industry block new entry and make more profits. But I think that the reason why his paper is so important is because a lot of economics used to be, this is where the market fails, and if the market fails, you're going to have regulatory intervention. And no discussion was about, is this regulation functioning the way it's supposed to do? There are mistakes. Are regulators sometimes evil, sometimes good? So it brought the topic of regulation from a perfect fix into a part of the discipline. So was at the same time an enormous enlargement of the discussion and an enrichment of the discussion.
Stigler's insight changed the discussion in economics. Did it practically change the way regulation is enacted?
That's a very good question. I think that yes. In the United States, for example, we started to see a deregulation trend in the late 70s. And everybody associated deregulation with Ronald Reagan. But in fact, deregulation started under Carter.
Bit by bit, we are chopping down the thicket of unnecessary federal regulations.
Under an economist, Alfred Kahn, that was very much influenced by all these ideas.
We've made a good start on turning the gobbledygook of federal regulations into plain English that people can understand.
And I think that without those ideas, probably the deregulation in trucking and airlines, and it says for the younger listeners, they don't remember a time where prices of tickets were fixed. As a result, airlines were competing on quality. Do you know, Bethany, that during the heydays of the regulated period, to fly from New York to San Francisco in first class, you will have a guy playing with a piano in first class because the competition on quality was so intense. You're paying a fortune, but yet you had a piano bar in first class. So that's the time of regulation. And to send a truck across interstate border, you have to ask a permission of the price that you are making. So this is stuff that is hard to imagine today, especially hard to imagine in America. For a foreigner, they always think America is free market. So, this is all but free market. That's the kind of regulation that was eliminated, also thanks to Stigler's insight. Now, one application that is an application mentioned already in the paper is to professional licensing. And actually, a former colleague of mine, and now moved to University of Washington, St. Louis, he's an accountant. He studied the accounting market. In the last 2 or 3 decades, the different states started to increase the educational requirement for accountants. So in order to get a state license to do accounting, you had to have, instead of 4 years, 5 years of college or equal education. He finds no effect of any improvement on the quality of accounting numbers, but you do find a significant increase in the wages of accountants. So you increase educational requirement is a barrier to entry that reduce entry and increase the prices of the existing players with a public interest in mind. We want to have better accounting. We are going to increase the number of years they have to study. And of course, surprise, surprise, the professors are all in favor because that means more demand for accounting classes, more students, and more money. So you have the academic industrial complex all pushing in one direction. It just turns out to be the wrong direction.
Really interesting. So I was struck by Cass Sunstein's criticism of Stigler, and I'd love to know what you made of it. I actually thought one piece of his criticism was essentially implying that Stigler was a journalist, because he wrote that his original essay was more of a narrative than it was empirical science. And I thought, aha, see, we journalists do have lasting impact through our narratives. But anyway, I'm curious to hear what you made of that criticism, whether you expected it or whether it was unanticipated.
No, I expected casting criticism. I thought that, more to the point, Kerry Coglianese had a very nice summary of what was wrong with the paper and also what was right with the paper.
And so I want to start with just highlighting a few weaknesses of the paper, but then go on to explain why, nevertheless, I think the paper has enjoyed so much impact.
And he went through a list of things, including that he overclaims, that some of the key concepts are not well specified.
Even Stigler acknowledged that the results were not very robust. He presented what he called a modicum of evidence for his theory.
Then he doesn't cite enough of the existing work before him and all the stuff that we generally see in every referee report. And then it concludes with the overclaiming of the key sentence. And it says the sentence that people have repeated over and over again as example of overclaiming. He said,
as a rule, regulation is acquired by industry and designed and operated primarily for its benefit.
So there is no doubt that this is an overstatement, certainly based on the empirical evidence he had at the time. However, the interesting part that Kerry pointed out to is that to some extent, the reason why this paper made such a big splash is because, number one, it tells a dramatic story. It turns a hero, the public interest regulator, into the villain.
Any of you have small children, you probably have watched the movie Frozen at least once. And it's a bit like Prince Hans, who first seems to fall in love with Anna, but in fact is only manipulating her to try to scheme and take over the kingdom. That's dramatic. And that's part of, I think, what is so appealing about Stigler, and so important, though, too.
Okay, and that is the Hollywood element of every good story, because it does have some real important element of truth.
It's actually capturing an important part of the reality of the regulatory process. Business interests simply do have a lot of influence, and the public interest theory that held sway at the time Stigler was writing was indeed too Pollyannish or naive.
Then the third point is that the paper is, if you read the paper and not just the Cliff Note version of it, the paper is much more subtle than is given credit for. So the nuances that are not in that statement are there.
He recognized that industry was far from monolithic. He recognized that not every regulation was there to advance industry.
But also because academics and society were at the right time. One thing that Kerry said that really struck a chord with me is in 1964, the trust in the federal government was at its high.
77% of the public, when surveyed, said they had high levels of trust in the federal government.
And then you had the civil rights movement, Vietnam, Watergate. You had a dramatic drop in trust in government.
By 1974, that level of trust was down to 36% or so.
And this paper was written exactly in that moment, and so was easy to pick up for people that started to be suspicious of the government.
If you're enjoying the discussions Luigi and I are having on this show, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show you should also check out. It's called Big Brains. Big Brains brings you the stories behind the pivotal breakthroughs that are reshaping our world. Change how you see the world and keep up with the latest academic thinking with Big Brains, part of the University of Chicago podcast network. So I thought one way to think about Stigler's work was there was a line in his paper that I thought is still interesting today. And he was talking about his insight as it applies to the field of banking. And he wrote, the power to insure new banks has been used by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to reduce the rate of entry into commercial banking by 60%. A piece of data showing that regulation actually helped to protect incumbents in the banking industry. And I thought that maybe thinking about regulation of our banking industry through a Stiglerian lens is pretty interesting, because in some ways, to me, and it shows the weakness in his theory, and that clearly some regulation, particularly post the financial crisis, has been applied to banks that they don't like and don't welcome. On the other hand, it has made new entrants into the field of banking quite difficult. We came out of the financial crisis talking about too big to fail, and we have too much bigger to fail now. And the question is, of course, what the rise of fintech and the rise of cryptocurrencies do to undermine that over time. But I thought that banking is an interesting industry through which to think about Stigler's insight.
Yeah, I think one of the things that emerged very clearly at the conference is that one of the detail of his idea of the way he applies is that the way the industry capture regulation is by making difficult to enter into the industry. This was clearly true of the tracking regulation that he uses in his paper, and is clearly true of licensing, but it's not true for every regulation. We cannot think that every environmental regulation is in that direction, and so on and so forth. So it's important to recognize that it's just a piece of a more general theory of regulation, is not the whole thing. And Jennifer New, a colleague at the conference, said something very insightful. Said that the title of the paper is not an economic theory of regulation, but the theory of economic regulation.
Perhaps it's best to appreciate Stigler's work for what he told us it was, which is a narrow theory of economic regulation, as the title suggests. And maybe that's limited to price controls, barriers to entry in established markets. And to the extent it's been marshaled as a citation to engage in public rational choice as a whole, perhaps we just appreciate it as a mechanism for generating falsifiable hypotheses. That's all it is.
So Stigler is very modest in his title, saying is a theory and of only one aspect of regulation, which is the regulation that applies to some economic aspects. So it doesn't necessarily true for privacy regulation, if you consider this is non-economic. It just applies when you enter in the economic sphere. And I would say of a particular type of regulation. So I think is very valuable in places where regulation can block entry. So as you know, at Chicago, we don't write cases in general, but I did write a couple of cases. One of the cases I wrote that I still teach is a case about a fintech, you mentioned fintech, a fintech in Chile called Cumplo that started basically a peer-to-peer lender in a market where consumer lending has stratospheric rates. And the reason why I love that case is because it's a very nice example of a Stiglerian approach to regulation, because the founder, before starting the company, goes to an uncle and asks this uncle, who is a lawyer, said, do you think I violate any law by starting this peer-to-peer lender? And the uncle said, no, I don't think that's the case. So he starts. Soon afterward, not only he received a notification, he received a criminal indictment for basically taking deposits without having the guarantee of deposit. And he tries to negotiate with the bank superintendent how to get out, but pretty quickly understand that the bank superintendent has been pushed there by the legal counsel of all the other banks, enforcing that regulation to preempt entry. That's a very clear example of a case where some regulation that has clear benefits, in a sense, you don't want anybody to take deposits freely. And even in the United States, there are rules against that. But then the enforcement is enforcement prompted by the industry to defend the industry. So the part where the Stiglerian message is more valid today is the extent to which the regulation is shaped over time by the industry, because also they are the only one with a real interest is keeping monitor every day. For a while, I was interested in financial regulation when they were writing Dodd-Frank, but I didn't keep up with every norm. If you pay a lot of money per hour, you can think about reading all the stuff. You don't read that stuff for fun, or for public interest. You read a little bit of public interest, but there is a limit to that. So the only one who know the financial regulation inside out are the lobbyists who are paid to do that. And so that really has a gigantic influence. But certainly some regulation is introduced for at least alleged public interest reason, not for just blocking entry.
You mentioned the humility in Stigler's paper, the nuance in it. And I love the idea that when you really think about the title of the paper, there's a certain amount of humility implied just in the way he titled the paper. I think that's really interesting. I also think it'd still be really interesting for someone to look at financial regulation post the crisis and through the last decade through a Stiglerian lens and figure out how much has been at the industry's behest, how much has been shaped by the industry, and how much actually has been against their kicking and screaming opposition. But lastly, as you were talking, it made me wonder if there's a new element, particularly, well, I say particularly in financial services regulation, but maybe in our talk about regulation of technology too, which is just complexity. When you think about financial services and regulation today, or technology and regulation today, the complexity is exponential from thinking about regulation of trucking firms, right? In terms of the amount of knowledge that is required to even understand what they're talking about in certain regulations. And so the possibility for a very capable, well-intentioned regulators to be misled simply by sheer complexity is, I think, a new element.
It is and is not. Clearly, the world has become more complex. But clearly, the amount of regulation has grown faster than the complexity in the world. I think that the experts have a big responsibility here, because on the one hand, the experts are enamored with the details and the technical aspect. On the other hand, they benefit tremendously from it because that's where their expertise is required. As a lawyer, I love to write very sophisticated sentences and also sneak in some loophole that then I can use later on by being a consultant on the other side. So this complexity is really part of the trick of the trade. And I'm not just criticizing lawyers, I criticize economists too. I think that we love our sophisticated models that of course require our sophisticated advice. And that's the reason why in my 2012 book, I said we should make an effort to keep the regulations simple, even if we give away a little bit of efficiency on the regulatory side. Why? Because we benefit tremendously on the political and monitoring side. So my example, and you can relate certainly to this, is think about the Volcker rule versus Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall was mandating a separation between investment banking and commercial banking, very rough, and any graduate student worth anything can write a paper showing that this is inefficient, that you can have a more sophisticated mechanism to separate one or the other to reach the same objective. The problem is that once you make that distinction a bit nuanced, then it's very easy to lobby and very difficult to monitor. So the Volcker rule was the idea.
Banks will no longer be allowed to own, invest, or sponsor hedge funds, private equity funds, or proprietary trading operations for their own profit, unrelated to serving their customers.
Which doesn't mean you have an explicit mandate. You mean that when you buy, in your mind, you're buying for a customer and not for yourself. Now, short of an fMRI, I don't think you can determine intent. And my claim is that the Volcker rule was adopted precisely because it was unenforceable. Tim Geithner was between a rock and a hard place, was between the rock of the banking industry to say, no F way, we don't want the separation, and the public at large that say, we want Glass-Steagall. And so he said, let's do a complicated version of Glass-Steagall that has the most respectable name in the industry, Volcker. And so we can pass it as a new Glass-Steagall, and we can let the industry do whatever they want. And in the process, full employment for lobbyists and lawyers. So that's, from their point, from the expert point of view, that's the best of all worlds. And so I admit in the book that I changed my mind. I was initially not so keen about Glass-Steagall, and I changed my mind and said, I actually want short and sweet, even at the cost of being slightly economic inefficient, because it's easier to enforce and easy to monitor.
It is a cynical take on the Volcker rule, but I have to admit I'm 100% in agreement with you, because if you talk to anybody inside a financial services firm, they'll say distinguishing trading for your own account versus trading for a customer is next to impossible. But I think what you're saying is that the most dangerous of all situations is when you have an already complex industry, and we respond to that with really complex regulations that only the experts can understand.
This can be applied to a lot of areas. So think about in the digital world. You can have a sophisticated scheme to separate the various businesses of Facebook, or you can break up Facebook. And I say, I actually tend to lean versus the breakup because it's simple and clear rather than all this in between. And by the way, in this, I'm 100% Stiglerian, because when he writes this paper in 1952, of course, he doesn't talk about digital platform because they didn't exist, but he talks about big business, and he says breaking up this business is not only the right thing to do, it's also the conservative thing to do. I said, wait a minute, what is conservative about breaking up big business? Oh, because the alternative is to regulate all the details. And those are extremely complex, extremely intrusive. At least if I break up, it's once and for all, and then we move on.
But that actually provides a really great modern way to interpret or think about Stigler, which is that much of the regulation being advocated for in Congress by the big tech companies now, when we hear it seen through a Stiglerian viewpoint, it's because they believe they can shape that regulation to their advantage and keep out other players and help reinforce their power rather than actually diminish it. And I think that's a very apropos insight, a very timely insight for today.
Yeah, and actually, if I may say, what I would like to add, one of the speakers of the conference was one emeritus colleague, Sam Peltzman. He was a student of Stigler and actually wrote an important paper afterward, Toward a More General Theory of Regulation, in which he was the first one to open up a bit this political game and say, look, there are competing interests that are trying to influence the politician or the regulators, and regulation is the result of competition among these interests.
Once you have the regulation, you have a political process, and the public choice elements can't be avoided. All of them, the collective action, the information, they imply interest group competition. The organized and informed group will always include the industry. And I don't think there's been any serious challenge to that aspect of the story.
Now, he writes in 1976, so it's still a pretty black box. But I think that the theory of regulation we need now is a theory that includes the public pressure. So now there is a big backlash against big tech. So there is a huge popular demand for some form of regulation. The industry sees the writing on the wall, and rather sort of that fighting, they join the crowd trying to direct it and trying to direct it in a way that is most convenient to itself. I think that that's where the Stiglerian point is very powerful and very strong.
I wanted to close by asking you, was there anything that came out of the conference that made you reevaluate your views on Stigler, that made you say, aha, this is something I hadn't thought of before, or this is a new way to think about this giant in this field that hadn't occurred to me?
So one thing that Andrej Leifer said that I thought was quite interesting is that in emphasizing that regulators can be involved in an exchange between some benefits from the industry with some public interest, actually, Stigler opened up the possibility of a discussion about corruption in economics.
And so much of the economics of corruption, which has actually become quite a significant industry in research and economics with, as you can imagine, a great deal of empirical evidence, is based very much on this Stiglerian idea of exchange between politicians and firms, which is to say some of what politicians get in return for favorable policies is bribes.
What is very surprising, and I think that's, if I may say, very Puritan of the United States, corruption was not a major item on the agenda until the late 80s. And I remember that a colleague of mine, who not surprisingly is Brazilian, wrote a paper about privatization in which she was explaining how manager of state-owned companies could be compensated, translate bribe, by the bidders to have more information and win the auction in the privatization phase. And one of our professors at MIT said with scandal, oh, but that's a model of bribing. Like, this is absolutely indecent that an economist should study this. The world has changed a lot since then, in many ways, thanks to Andrei Schleifer and the impact of his work. But I think that, in a sense, Stigler legitimized the study of these aspects that are not particularly pretty, but are incredibly important around the world, but also increasingly so also in the United States. I think that this Puritan view of the United States is kind of self-defeating. And I have to say that over the years, I realized that coming with my cynical Italian view, most of the time I'm right.
Luigi, are there solutions to this issue?
We discussed that at the conference. There were some interesting back and forth, especially with Jennifer New, who is an administrative lawyer. And she thinks that, for example, career civil servant could be a good deterrent to capture.
These career civil servants are not only more insulated from capture, but I think that to draw on public administration work, there is a real culture of thinking about their own institutional roles as serving the public interest.
And so are judges.
Regulations of the market for regulations probably are more immune to capture because of the fact that we have Article 3 judges that are tenure protected, salary protected, and therefore will strike down the efforts of industry groups. For example, when the Chamber of Commerce challenged the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act in 2003, the Supreme Court in McConnell versus SEC upheld the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act despite the best efforts of industry groups.
With all the complaints we have of judges in the United States, we know that they tend not to be captured by one industry or the other. So I think it is possible, but that method is not perfect either. Coming from a civil law country with a lot of civil servants, I'm not exactly enamored of bureaucracy, but I do see the trade-off between political appointees that, especially in the United States, go back and forth with the industry very fast, and civil servant. But one point I would like to conclude with, because I think is very important, related to how capturable a sector in industry is, I think that the differential wage with the private sector is incredibly important, and something that people have not paid enough attention is 30 or 40 years ago, for example, a judge was making probably either equal or more than a law partner. Today makes 1/5, 1/6 of what a law partner makes. Many regulators used to do maybe 30, 40% less. Now they do 1/10 of what they do in the industry. I believe that a lot of people have a lot of good in their heart and they want to help the public good, and they're more likely to do it if it doesn't cost them a fortune. So you are willing to give up 20% of your salary to serve the public good. You're not likely to give up 90% of your salary for the public good. We have forgotten that.
It's a really interesting observation, and one I've discussed with people as well about another pernicious impact of widening income inequality and the increased gap between those at the very, very top and everyone else, which is this perverse notion that it actually also decreases effective regulation because you end up with the best and the brightest due to the incredible economic rewards of being in the private sector not serving as regulators, whereas in a different day they would have. Precisely your point.
Capital Isn't is a podcast from the University of Chicago Stigler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. Also, check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stigler Center. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review to Capital Isn't wherever you get your podcasts.